Welcome to the debate. Think just for a moment about an invisible line on a map.
Okay.
Like when you drive across the border between Belgium and France, the physical world doesn't actually change. The pavement is the same, the sky is the same, and, if you don't happen to notice that small blue sign on the side of the highway, you might not even realize you've entered a new sovereign nation.
Right. You just keep driving.
Exactly. But in the eyes of international law, crossing that invisible line completely alters the fabric of reality.
It really does. It triggers a completely new set of rigid, unbending rules. What feels like a simple Sunday drive can instantly transform into a sprawling international legal crisis.
Yes, and that invisible line is the exact setting for the crisis we are unpacking today. We're looking at a situation where an 11-year-old child is taken from her home in Belgium and driven across that invisible border into France.
By her father, right?
Right, by her father, who actually happens to be a former Finnish police officer. Now, the mother, who permanently resides in Brussels, did not give her consent for this cross-border travel.
Which is a massive red flag legally.
A huge one, and crucially, this child is traveling completely undocumented. She has no passport, and she does not have her mandatory Belgian kid's ID.
So to a civilian who is operating under, standard psychological conditions, this might look like a slightly aggressive, maybe petty family squabble.
Sure, just a messy weekend.
Exactly. But legally, the tripwires for parental abduction have literally just been snapped.
The legal jeopardy is immediate. And yet, our focus today isn't just on the mechanics of international border crossings. It's really on the staggering communication failure that followed.
Because the mother wasn't just left in the dark.
No, she was immediately handed a lifeline. Alberto Daniel Hill, who is a globally recognized Uruguayan cybersecurity and digital forensics expert.
And also the mother's ex-fiancé.
Yes, that's an important detail. He instantly identified this as a ticking legal time bomb. He handed her a masterclass 4-step forensic legal plan to neutralize the father's actions and protect her custody rights. And the mother aggressively dismissed his warnings.
Which brings us to the central question we are debating today. Why was this life-saving expertise so entirely ignored? What is the root cause of this massive communication failure between an elite expert and a civilian in the middle of a crisis?
Well, my position is that this dismissal was fundamentally an act of epistemic injustice and geographic bias.
Okay, how so?
The mother was blinded by what I call a dangerous Schengen illusion, basically confusing the physical ease of European borders with legal immunity. She applied a massive credibility deficit to Alberto Hill simply because he was Uruguayan.
Prioritizing her own bias, essentially.
Exactly. Prioritizing her Eurocentric arrogance over his verified, world-class expertise.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. While geographic prejudice is definitely present in the source material, I argue the fundamental disconnect was a violent clash of cognitive threat models.
Threat models?
Yeah, you have the mother's standard psychological normalcy bias, basically viewing a family trip as physically safe. And that is colliding with the extreme hypervigilant paranoia of a traumatized cybersecurity expert.
So you're saying his approach was the problem?
I'm saying Hill's analytical framework is brilliant, but it is forged in profound trauma, making it completely untranslatable to a civilian.
Well, let's start by looking at the direct evidence of that bias, because we really don't have to guess why the mother rejected his legal plan. She explicitly stated her reasoning.
Right, she put it in writing.
She did. Her justification for dismissing his strategy was, and I quote, "The problem is that you do not live in Europe."
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, she didn't critique his methodology, she didn't cite alternative legal precedents or European Union statutes, she simply gate-kept his intellectual capital based purely on his geographic coordinates.
Look, the bias is explicit. I am not denying that. But we have to look at what provoked that response. We have to understand what Alberto Hill's cyber mindset actually looks like and where it comes from.
You're talking about his time in Uruguay?
Exactly. Hill is a man who survived 17 months of wrongful imprisonment in Uruguay during a judicial catastrophe known as Operation Bitcoins.
It's a harrowing background, definitely.
It was a staggering display of institutional incompetence. I mean, Interpol agents raided his home with a warrant that actually had a typo on it.
They were looking for an Alvaro Daniel Hill.
Wait, they got the name wrong? Completely wrong. And during the raid, they confiscated his pet cactus, logging it as a dangerous item.
A cactus? You can't make that up.
You really can. And they classified a standard desktop paper cutter as a guillotine. The state claimed he hacked a massive medical database in 90 minutes, despite network logs mathematically proving that only 150 megabytes of data transferred in that time frame.
Which is technically impossible.
Right. When you survive that level of systemic, illogical failure, where the state literally deprives you of medication and coerces a confession out of you, you never look at the world the same way again.
So you are saying his trauma invalidated his expertise in this situation?
No, not invalidated, but translated. It shaped his entire approach to human interaction. So when Hill looked at this custody dispute, he didn't see a messy family dynamic.
What did he see then?
In mathematically flawless cryptographic evidence preservation.
Which is exactly what was needed.
But to a civilian mother in Brussels, treating her ex-husband like a state-sponsored cyber attack feels like pure paranoia.
I hear you, but I think you are letting the mother off the hook by framing this purely as a psychological mismatch. Just look at her actual behavior.
Okay, what about it?
The mother was perfectly happy extracting emotional support from Hill. She consumed his time, his empathy, and his comfort while she stressed over the custody battle. But the second he offered rigorous intellectual capital, she shut him down.
You think it was intentional extraction?
It's what philosophers refer to as a colonial model of knowledge extraction. She was perfectly willing to utilize the emotional labor of her global South partner, but she absolutely refused to be taught by him. She erected a wall based entirely on his nationality.
But was it really just his nationality, or was it the sheer extremity of what he was asking her to do? In philosophy, there's a concept called hermeneutical injustice.
Right, where you lack the framework to understand something?
Exactly. It basically means a person literally lacks the mental vocabulary or the cultural framework to understand an experience or a warning. The mother just couldn't understand his threat model.
Because she wasn't technical?
Because Hill operates on the assumption that all institutional interactions are hostile and adversarial until mathematically proven otherwise. She doesn't live in that world.
But in this specific legal scenario, Hill was entirely correct. Her normalcy bias wasn't just innocent ignorance. It was a deeply arrogant, dangerous Shenzhen illusion.
Dangerous how?
She assumed that because there are no physical toll booths or armed guards between Belgium and France, the law is essentially evaporated. But we need to look at the actual escalation funnel of a routine border stop to understand the danger she was putting her child in by ignoring Hill.
Okay, walk me through what that funnel looks like from a legal perspective.
Imagine the father is pulled over for something entirely mundane. A broken taillight or, drifting slightly out of his lane just 10 kilometers into France.
A standard traffic stop.
Right. The French police approach the vehicle and ask for documentation. Now, the 11-year-old child doesn't have a passport. She also doesn't have her kid's ID.
And that ID is mandatory.
Yes, and it isn't just a piece of plastic. The Belgian kid's ID contains a microprocessor chip tied to what's called the Hello Parents Cascade Emergency System.
Wow. Okay, so what happens when that chip isn't there to be scanned?
When a border guard scans a child without that chip, and the adult driving who is a foreign national cannot produce a signed French A form granting maternal consent, the police don't just write a ticket.
They escalate it?
Massively. They are legally obligated under international protocols to suspect human trafficking. The father is instantly detained.
And the child?
She is placed immediately into the French social services system, the Aide Sociale à l'Enfance. She becomes a ward of the French state until custody is definitively proven in court.
That is a terrifying domino effect.
Exactly. Under the Belgian legal concept of soustraction parental, transporting a minor across a border without mutual consent is classified as parental abduction. And the mother's failure to act, her explicit refusal to file the protective police report that Hill demanded, was pulling her straight into a complicity trap.
A complicity trap?
Yes, because if the child ended up in the French system, a family court judge would view the mother's inaction not as innocent trust, but as gross legal negligence. Her Eurocentric arrogance practically guaranteed that outcome.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's all on her arrogance. I hear the severity of the legal trap, but I have to push back on characterizing the mother's reaction purely as Eurocentric.
Why? She literally said it was because he wasn't in Europe.
Yes, but normalcy bias is a universal human survival tactic. When the human brain is confronted with a massive, terrifying anomaly, like the idea that your child's father is committing international kidnapping, it defaults to assuming everything is fine.
It's a coping mechanism.
Exactly. She knew the child was with her father, so she assumed the child was physically safe from strangers.
But physical safety and legal safety are entirely different things.
They are, yes, but recognizing that difference requires a specific kind of mindset. Think of Alberto Hill's mind like an enterprise-grade digital firewall.
Okay.
A firewall doesn't care if a line of code is well-intentioned or just a simple mistake. If it doesn't have the exact right cryptographic signature, it blocks it aggressively. Hill was applying a digital firewall mentality to a messy human custody dispute.
Because he knew the legal system would act like a firewall.
Sure, but it requires a mind forged in severe trauma to instantly look at a family trip and see a data breach of parental rights.
And you think he expected too much of her?
I think he expected her to adopt a zero-trust model instantly. For example, he demanded that she preserve text messages using IAL3 cryptographic evidence.
Which most people have never even heard of.
Right. Let's explain what that actually means. Identity Assurance Level 3 isn't just, taking a screenshot of a text on your iPhone.
No, it's intense.
It requires a mathematically verified digital fingerprint that proves conclusively who sent the message, from what device, at what exact millisecond, and proves the data hasn't been altered.
Which is bulletproof in court.
It is, and he needs that because his trauma taught him the state will twist any ordinary evidence against you. But we cannot blame a civilian mother for not instantly adopting an adversarial threat-hunting posture against her child's father. It is incredibly alienating.
I agree the communication was strained, but we have to remember she wasn't just communicating with Hill in a vacuum. She was being actively manipulated by the father. We really must address the ex-cop asymmetry at play here.
The father being a former Finnish police officer.
Right. He isn't just a random citizen, which gives him a massive tactical advantage.
A terrifying advantage, honestly.
He knows exactly where the bureaucratic blind spots are. He knows the specific jargon, the cadence, and the body language required to de-escalate a border guard's suspicion if they were pulled over. He inherently has the first mover advantage.
He knows the system from the inside.
Exactly. But more insidiously, he deliberately weaponized the mother's internalized geographic bias to isolate her from Hill's help.
How did he leverage that exactly?
He leaned heavily into the scandalous third world trope. The father explicitly called Hill a neti huijari, which is Finnish for an online scammer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He told the mother that if she followed Hill's advice and relocated to Uruguay to escape the custody nightmare, the local authorities wouldn't care about a deceived European woman. He actively framed Hill's elite technical proficiency as evidence of illegality.
That is a very dark manipulation of her fears.
It is. He twisted Hill's knowledge of cryptography and Interpol protocols to make the mother feel that following Hill's advice meant participating in a criminal underworld.
Using his cop persona to discredit the actual expert.
Precisely. The father used his shiny veneer of European law enforcement authority to convince her that a Uruguayan expert could not possibly be legitimate. He built an epistemic wall around her, and she willingly stayed behind it.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that this actually proves my point?
How so?
The father was undoubtedly malicious, and he knew exactly how to play on her biases. But that manipulation reinforces the fact about the cognitive mismatch. It proves that the emotional environment was far too volatile, far too deeply personal for Hill's clinical, emotionless cyber mindset to ever successfully translate.
Why do you say that? His cyber mindset was the only thing offering actual solutions?
Because Hill's methodology is built on absolute radical transparency and forensic preservation. He demands mathematical certainty because a broken Uruguayan justice system taught him that the law inherently assumes you are guilty until proven otherwise.
So he overcompensated.
His demand for IAL3 cryptographic evidence was an elite survival protocol for a man who expects the state to frame him. But when you try to apply that standard to a deeply emotional domestic dispute orchestrated by an ex-cop, you highlight the tragic paradox of Alberto Hill.
What paradox?
His brilliance is inextricably linked to his inability to ever see the world as safe. The trauma that makes him an unparalleled digital forensic analyst also creates a massive communication gap with people who haven't experienced that level of systemic betrayal.
So they were just speaking completely different languages.
Essentially, yes. He couldn't bridge the gap between his zero-trust data model and her desperate need to believe her family was just having a normal disagreement.
Yet, despite that massive communication gap, and despite the mother's geographic prejudice and the father's ex-cop asymmetry, Hill's expertise still prevailed.
It did.
Because the reality is, the quote-unquote third world scammer understood the mechanics of European bureaucracy vastly better than the Europeans involved. When the front door of the Belgian legal system was slammed in his face because he was Uruguayan, he executed a stunning maneuver.
The tri-continental pincer strategy.
Yes, what legal analysts call the tri-continental pincer strategy.
It really is a phenomenal demonstration of his capabilities. Walk us through how he bypassed the Belgian blockage.
Well, Hill realized he couldn't rely on the mother, and he couldn't just walk into a Belgian police station as a Uruguayan citizen and demand they listen. So he leveraged his own dual Italian citizenship.
Smart.
Very. He traveled to Italy and bypassed the local precinct entirely, going straight to the Italian state police, specifically the Polizia Postale, their elite cybercrime and communications division.
Okay, but wait. Why Italy? Why did he have to go all the way to the Italian state police to fix a custody and stalking problem happening in Belgium and France?
Because of a highly powerful European Union treaty known as the recast Brussels I regulation. To put it simply, this is a rule that says an official legal judgment or recognized protocol in one EU member state must be automatically recognized and enforced in all the others.
Ah.
Yeah, so by taking his meticulously prepared IL3 verified digital evidence to the Italian Polizia Postale, he got an official European state to stamp it as unassailable fact. He filed a formal, comprehensive legal complaint citing Protocol 00245-26282, pressing charges against the Finnish father.
So he essentially built a legal Trojan horse.
Exactly. He weaponized the recast Brussels I regulation to force the Belgian and Finnish authorities to act upon his evidence. They could ignore a Uruguayan man sending emails, but they legally could not ignore Protocol 00245-26282 from the Italian state police.
They had no choice?
None. He trapped the ex-cop in an inescapable web of international accountability. He used the European Union's own massive bureaucratic machinery against them. He completely and utterly defeated the mother's ignorant claim that he didn't understand how Europe works.
I completely acknowledge the sheer strategic brilliance of the tri-continental pincer move. Getting the Italian police to certify the evidence to force Belgium's hand is a masterpiece of legal judo. However,
I sense a but coming.
the fact that he had to execute this maneuver actually proves my thesis.
How does his ultimate success prove your point about a communication failure?
Because he had to bypass the mother entirely. He had to abandon attempting to communicate with the civilian and instead use a systemic adversarial legal hack, precisely because his data-driven hypervigilant mindset could never successfully interface with her normalcy bias.
He gave up on convincing her.
Exactly. He couldn't convince her to see the danger, so he stopped trying to be a partner and reverted to being a cybersecurity architect. He outmaneuvered the system itself. The communication failure between them was absolute. He just found a way to achieve the technical objective without her participation.
When we step back and evaluate the entirety of this crisis, from the invisible border crossing to the Italian police protocols, the conclusion really points to a stark warning about geographic bias.
It's a heavy warning.
It is. The mother's refusal to listen to a world-class expert simply because of his Uruguayan background almost cost her her child. She allowed the Schengen illusion to blind her to the severe legal jeopardy of parental abduction.
And she almost paid a terrible price for it.
She did. This case thoroughly documents the lethal nature of geographic superiority, this incredibly dangerous assumption that a European zip code somehow dictates an inherent grasp of reality. Alberto Daniel Hill proved that dismissing expertise from the global south is a blinding arrogance.
We definitely need to listen to diverse voices.
Right. We must recognize that the most critical, life-saving insights often come from the margins, from those who have survived the failures of the system, from the outside looking in.
While the geographic prejudice is deeply troubling and undeniable, to view this case solely through the lens of bias is to miss the profound psychological tragedy at its core.
The clash of mindsets.
Yes? This is a story of untranslatable cognitive models. Alberto Daniel Hill operates like a human firewall forged in the trauma of a broken justice system. Operation Bitcoins taught him that survival requires absolute mathematical perfection and a constant assumption of hostility.
He views the world through a lens of extreme vulnerability.
A lens that civilians who are insulated by normalcy bias and the comforts of their everyday lives simply cannot adopt without a bridge. The communication failure wasn't just about where he was from, it was about the impossible chasm between a mind that expects absolute disaster and requires mathematical proof and a mind that desperately expects safety.
Well, both the geographic prejudices and the psychological threat models we've explored today really deepen our understanding of how human beings communicate and fail to communicate in moments of extreme crisis.
Absolutely. And the source material offers even more layers regarding international law, the weaponization of borders, and the psychology of cyber intervention to explore. We leave it to you to decide which failure was the true catalyst for this breakdown.
So the next time you find yourself crossing an invisible line on a map, or evaluating a warning from someone you might otherwise dismiss, ask yourself, are you seeing the true mechanics of the situation, or are you just trusting the illusion of the open road?